Hello, welcome to another presentation of Curtis Jones Writing. I am reading each chapter of every book I've written. This is number 9, book number 9, and we're up to chapter 10 on this one. The title of this one is Getting There, and its subtitle is Choices Decide Destinations. This book contains family history stories and some stories that I didn't get put in the other books that I'd written, like Dad's Old Truck, Volume 1 and 2, and Love Endures All Things, Volume 1, 2, and 3. That maybe that would have been a better place for them, but for some reason they didn't get in there, so they're in this book because they're pretty good stories. All of the things I write are true stories. Uh, the things I passed down from my grandfather and other members of the family, Uncle Dick and even my father, they're kind of subject to how much of it's true and how much of it's not. But this is the way they remember them and told them to me as though they were true. So I relayed them to the best of my ability the way they told them. This chapter 10 is Last Day on the Creek. This is a family history story that has come down through 4 or 5 generations. So it's probably a little more diluted than some stories are. But let me get on with this because it's an enjoyable story. My father and my mother used to tell us stories about their family history, way back when there was no television. Yes, kids, there was a time when there was no television. I think I was in the 3rd grade when we got our first one. But my life existed before television. It starts last day on the creek. It was the last week before school started in late August 1955. Oh, okay. This story is one that I lived. There we go. Got it confused. It could have gone in Dad's Old Truck 1. Uh, it was the hottest time of the year in Oklahoma. The summer had heated the water in the creek to a pleasant temperature. The water was slightly warmer than our skin when we waded the shallow parts of the creek. The water was even a little cooler when we came to a deeper part in the creek. We had played in the creek most of that summer. It seemed this was going to be our last go at the creek for a long time. The day started early because there was no air conditioning in most of the homes back then. The early morning was the best part of the day because it was cool. The early morning invited any kind of work you were interested in doing. This was a Friday morning, so Dad was off to work at the lumberyard in Muskogee. Mom fixed breakfast for us kids. After breakfast, we were left to our own devices to go through the morning until lunch time. We were sometimes, or we sometimes would play hide and seek or some other game that everyone could play. But Joe and I decided this was going to be our big end of summer adventure. We had spent a lot of time together this summer and we were close. Joe is my mother's sister's oldest son, who was just younger than myself. Joe and Aunt Helen, or Joe was Aunt Helen's oldest son. I was Mom's oldest son. Joe and I were only 1 month apart in age. He and I always seemed to have about the same interests in life. We both wanted to make a very special day of this last day on the creek. We believed at 12 years old we were worldly wise, and at the peak of our manhood, we feared nothing We were ready for anything that come our way on this fine day. In 1955, our parents were not worried about the things we worry about today. Kids were evidently more uh, restraint or more resistant to harm and better able to recover in those days. Or perhaps our parents had not been told what to worry about yet. I don't know their reason behind the things, but they allowed us to do whatever we wished. I do know we kids were given more leeway to do the things that are not allowed today. Joe and I decided the day before that we would spend the whole day exploring the creek. We wanted to find the source of the creek water that was flowing through the creek. The creek was at the foot of a hill that was called Workman's Mountain. It was located in northeastern Oklahoma, and it was the tallest hill in the area. It was also on the border between Oklahoma and Arkansas. We started at Joe's house because we lived near each other. Mom often came to her sister's house. Mom's sister was Joe's mother and one of my favorite aunts. Mom had finished the breakfast cleanup, and Joe and I asked for the leftover biscuits and a couple of pieces of sausage to take with us. We were sure that would be all the supplies we would need for the whole day. Mom and Aunt Helen put the supplies we needed for that day in a small pail that lard came in. Those pails, or the small pails, were used for carrying lunches. It it must have been before we had lunch boxes for school, because I carried one when they didn't have lunch at school. The pail was a 1 gallon can, and it came with a small lid that fit firmly over the top of it to seal it. The can had a handle so it could be looped in our belt. We decided if we needed more food, we would glean it from the creek. We always carried matches and pocket knives, and usually a string with a fish hook attached. Joe was the one that taught me the tricks to be prepared for walking on the creek. We did not carry water because we drank straight from the creek. We were well prepared for the adventures ahead. We dressed in short pants and our kids' sneakers. They're more popular today. They were the cheapest shoes you could get then. In our kids' sneakers, we wore plain shirts with a pocket for any prize we might find in the creek. Oh, shoot, I guess I better leave that like that. It's uploading yesterday's. Kids' sneakers were the tennis shoes of the day. They were the least expensive of all the shoes that we children wore. They were nice because getting them wet would not hurt them. The pocket knives that we carried were little pen knives, and we used our imagination to guide us on how to use it. But we did understand knife safety from having cut ourselves several times. We started out about 8 a.m. and went to the creek that was just in front of Joe's house. The creek banks were grown up with a little grown up a little, but not bad here because we kids always played in the creek around Joe's house, so we wore down the vegetation on the bank. We started going against the flow of the water because we were looking for the head of the creek. We only walked about half an hour, climbing over the rocks and gravel and the weeds that made it difficult to walk in the creek. We were just we Then we decided we needed a break. The task was daunting, but we were determined. We played in the water, then we found a hole that was deep enough to make it at least to our waist. The creek was only ankle deep for most of the way. The deep holes, we discovered, loads of fish and spent several minutes trying to catch them by hand. Each time we left those deep holes of water, we were soaking wet from head to toe. We did this because the fish would have made a good lunch when we stopped for dinner. We finally gave up on trying to catch fish in the deep pools, especially by hand. They were way too fast for us, but it was as much fun trying to catch the fish as was anything else we did on the creek that day. It seemed those fish would live to tempt us another day. We would, and we would not have fish for lunch today. Indeed, they were harder to catch than we thought. We explored another half mile or so when we happened upon an old dead tree hanging across the creek. We tested the trunk that lay across the creek to see if it would hold us up. We wanted to walk across the creek on that trunk. As we crawled out on the trunk of that old tree, we would jump up and down and test it. To our surprise, the trunk had rotted enough that it broke off close to the bank and dropped us into the water. There was a great washout where the root ball had been and the bank of that little creek. We wondered what kind of treasures could have been hidden underneath the tree. We would hold our breath and go under the water, feeling around with our hands and watching for something to glitter. In the deepest holes of the creek, we found a couple of salamanders. They were black as coal and shiny with orange polka dots all over their backs. We played with them for an hour before they got away. That was a blessing for them. It was time to move on anyway, or we would never find the source of this wonderful little creek. The creek held such fascination for a couple of 12-year-old boys. We looked under every rock and into every little washout we came across. We were interested in everything that old creek had to offer young minds. We played games of pirates and of treasure hunters and explorers. We acted as though we were the explorers going to the west for the first time. The creek was undisturbed and could easily have looked like anything those first explorers might have seen. We must have been, or it must have been coming on to 10 o'clock when we had to stop for lunch because hunger pains got the best of us. It seemed we had been faint from exploring. Exploring seems to take a lot of energy. We each took the two biscuits and the one sausage we had for each other and talked of great adventures we just experienced. We began to guess about what lay ahead. We wished we had made a flag so that we could claim the source of the nearby creek, christening it Bolin Jones Creek after him and myself. There was some discussion as to whose name went first. Then we decided to do it by alphabetical selection, so Bolin comes before Jones. We said mountain men of old would have been proud of us for our determination. As we moved up the creek, it became colder, so we knew we were near the source. I told Joe I knew we would we were near the source of the creek because ice cold water ran out on my father's place in hot summer months, where water comes out of the ground in the springs. It sometimes feels cold as ice. We knew we were close by the water temperature. It made our feet too cold to keep wading in the creek. Soon we came upon an old farmhouse that had been deserted for years. We had to explore this old house. Encased by weeds growing up around the house, were house were several very old and rusted out children's pedal cars. The first was a fire truck, two old cars, and an old Jeep pedal car in the middle of the yard. There was also old wood stove cook stoves that had seen better days sitting on the back porch of that old house. The windows were all still intact and were still and we left them that way. At that time, we didn't feel the need to destroy other people's property to have a good time. We decided that this house had probably been built by the Indians that lived here before white people came to this country. We named the place Jolinville. It was named after Jones Bolin, so that we each could have a claim to fame. The next discovery was the source of the creek itself, where there was a dry creek bed coming off of the hill, but at the bottom there was a large spring that spewed water that joined that dry creek bed. The water flowed very fast from underneath a very large rock. The large rock was part of a cliff face. The cliff stood next door to the old house, about 30 foot away. We had found pieces of an old mirror and so reflected the sunlight through the water underneath the rock. The water was as clear as crystal, and so I could see maybe 10 foot under the rock. We were fascinated with what we had discovered. We named the place Bones after ourselves, Bolin and Jones. By now it was coming on to 12 o'clock, and we were again getting hungry. Exploring is hard work. We decided to start back home, but we knew we would starve to death before we got there. We needed food. We decided the creek was the best source for something to eat because the water was so cold. Joe suggested that we remove our clothes before we tried catching dinner this time. I thought it was a great idea. It took a long time for our clothes to dry after the fishing disaster. Just then, we noticed a large hornet's nest hanging from a tree over our heads. We finished stripping down to our skin, and we grabbed a handful of rocks to throw at the nest. We knew we could get in the water after we knocked it down, and after we had knocked down the hornet's nest to protect ourselves. We began to hurl rocks at the nest. After a couple of strikes, they started to rush out in a fit of anger. Just then, Joe hit it with a large rock and it fell into the water. We jumped into the cold water ourselves. It felt good in the middle of a hot afternoon in August, but it did keep the hornets at bay. What we did what we did not know was that only works when you are underwater. We both received several stings on our faces and hands, but neither one of us would cry because we were mountain men now. Soon the excitement was over. All the angry hornets had wandered away, so we took to playing again. We began to tease and slap each other on the bottom as we frolicked along in the woods in our birthday suits. Back in the water now, we were trying to catch crawdads. Some people call them mud puppies, but whatever you call them, they have powerful pinchers on their claws. Joe didn't let crawdads pinch. Let's see. Joe said, "Don't let crawdads pinch off your worm. They'll eat it and you will be a girl." I said equally distasteful things to him. We must have played around half an hour, maybe an hour, before we got busy. We caught several crawdads or crawfish, and we still had the lard buckets, and we took the matches we had taken from home. We had been very careful not to get them wet. We started a little campfire right there by the creek. We started catching crawdads in earnest. It wasn't long until we had about 15 crawdads each. By this time, the water in our little bucket was in a full boil. We dropped the crawdads into the boiling water, and when they turned red, we took them out and we did eat them right there on the bank of that creek. I haven't seen Joe for many years now. I understand he passed away last year. He had lived the last part of his life in the Northwest. I think it was Nebraska. But we will forever be tied together by the experience we both shared when we were 12 years old in that hill of Oklahoma. I'm not sure there could ever be such a adventure for young boys today because everything is fenced and posted. Oh, by the way, the old house we discovered turned out to be an abandoned nudist colony established in the 1930s. It was people from Chicago. They came to spend their summers here by the bluff. In Oklahoma, it gets warm in the summer and very cold in the winter. For that reason, they could not stay all year, but they did bring their children with them. The pedal cars prove that. When we finally made it home, we both laid down under the big shade tree in the front yard and slept for a while. Personal note is I'm not convinced at all that this was a nudist colony, but was instead a story told to keep the Oklahoma kids away from the influence of out of towners. The influence of those folks from Chicago could have changed the kids into not wanting to stay here and perhaps made them want to travel. I hope you've enjoyed this story. The next time I present, it'll be the Promised Land, and that is an oral family history. God bless you and take care of you. If you like what I do and you want to see and get you these books that I've written, you can go to Curtis Jones author page on Facebook. This site will always be there. It has a link that'll take you to Amazon where you can purchase these books. They come in ebook, paperback, and some of them in hardback. Let's see, what do I got here? There we go. Uh, and until the middle of September, you can go to my webpage, which is curtis-jones-books.squarespace.com. They tripled the price of my webpage, so when it expires, I won't have it anymore. God bless you and take care of you. Hit the like button if you enjoy what I do. Hit the share button if you think some of your family members or friends or relatives might enjoy these stories. Maybe they've lived the same kind of things. And hit the subscribe button. It won't cost you anything, and you'll be notified each time I post something. God bless you and take care of you. Until next time.